Two monks walked out of China carrying the secret that would transform an empire. Emotion value tense. Picture this. The year is 563, and somewhere along the endless ribbon of the Silk Road, two nameless figures clutch bamboo walking staves as they pass through customs checkpoints where discovery means death. Inside those hollow bamboo canes, hidden among personal effects and devotional texts, wait the most valuable creatures in the world. Silkworm eggs and living larvae, smuggled from a civilization that had guarded their secret for 1,000 years. The road stretches endlessly before them, winding through mountain passes where the air grows thin and the cold bites through their robes, then descending into valleys where heat shimmers off the desert floor like water that will never quench their thirst. What would drive men to risk everything for insects? The answer begins not in China, but in Constantinople, where Emperor Justinian sat on his golden throne contemplating a problem that no army could solve. The greatest city in the Western world spread beneath his palace windows, its domes and spires catching the morning light, its harbors crowded with ships from every corner of the known world. Markets hummed with the voices of merchants speaking a dozen languages. The scent of spices mingled with the salt air from the Bosphorus. But Justinian understood that beneath this magnificence lay a dangerous vulnerability that threatened everything he had built. Emotion value tent/every bolt of silk that adorned his court, every purple robe that marked imperial authority, every diplomatic gift that purchased alliances and terrified enemies, came from a single source: China, 5,500 kilometers away, across mountains and deserts and the territory of Persia, Byzantium's eternal rival. The Persians controlled every trade route, extracted enormous tolls on every shipment, and could strangle Byzantine access to silk whenever political winds shifted unfavorably. Imagine running the most powerful empire in the Western world, yet being economically dependent on your enemies for the fabric that symbolized your authority. Every time a Persian ambassador smirked at a Byzantine silk robe, the emperor knew the truth. His magnificence hung by threads his rivals controlled. The humiliation burned deeper than any military defeat because it was constant, inescapable, woven into the very garments that proclaimed his power. Think about what that dependence meant in practical terms. When Justinian needed silk for the ceremonial robes worn at coronations, he had to hope that Persian toll collectors were feeling generous. When he wanted to send diplomatic gifts to the king of the Franks or the rulers of distant Britain, he first had to pay tribute to the Shah. When his generals required silk standards for imperial regiments or silk padding for ceremonial armor, the empire's enemies took their cut of every transaction. The mathematics of humiliation compounded with every purchase. Emotion value tense. The situation seemed impossible to resolve through conventional means. Military conquest of the silk routes would require campaigns spanning thousands of miles against multiple powerful empires simultaneously. The logistics alone would bankrupt even the Byzantine treasury, and success was far from guaranteed against enemies who knew the terrain and could simply retreat deeper into Asia. Diplomatic negotiations with China required traversing those same Persian-controlled territories, meaning Justinian would have to ask permission from his rivals to reduce his dependence on them. And waiting simply meant accepting permanent vulnerability, permanent tribute payments to Persian middlemen, permanent strategic weakness that any competent enemy could exploit. But Justinian was not a conventional emperor. The man who would rebuild the Hagia Sophia into a monument that still inspires awe 15 centuries later, who would reform Roman law into the foundation of Western legal tradition, who would nearly reconquer the Western Empire through military genius and diplomatic cunning. This was not a leader who accepted impossible situations. He understood that sometimes the boldest solutions required not armies but audacity. Not conquest, but cleverness. Not thousands of soldiers, but 2 devoted men willing to walk into danger. He needed not an army, but a heist. The monks who would change history were Nestorian Christians, members of a theological tradition that had spread eastward along the Silk Road after their beliefs were declared heretical in Constantinople. You might think this would make them poor candidates for an imperial mission. After all, the Byzantine Orthodox Church considered Nestorians dangerously mistaken about the nature of Christ, and religious tensions between the two communities had sometimes erupted into persecution. What emperor trusts heretics with his most important secret mission? But Justinian saw what others missed. Expelled from the Byzantine religious mainstream, Nestorians had established communities throughout Central Asia and into China itself, creating networks that spanned the very territories Justinian needed to penetrate. These monks knew the East. They had lived there, prayed there, built monasteries there. They had connections in Sogdiana, the trading hub where Chinese goods passed into Persian and Byzantine hands. They understood silk production because they had witnessed it in monasteries and noble households where the art flourished. They spoke languages that would sound like gibberish to any Byzantine soldier, but would mark them as fellow travelers to guards along the route. Their very marginality made them perfect spies. Emotion value tense when Justinian approached them with his proposition. They understood exactly what he was asking, and they understood the risks with perfect clarity. China's silk monopoly rested on a single biological secret: the silkworm. Not just any caterpillar, but the specific species Bombyx mori, which had been domesticated so thoroughly over millennia that it could no longer survive without human care. The worms that spun the precious threads, the mulberry leaves that fed them, the techniques that harvested their cocoons at precisely the right moment, the methods for unraveling single threads that could stretch over a mile from each cocoon. All of this was knowledge the Chinese had protected for centuries under penalty of death. The punishment for attempting to smuggle silkworms out of China was not imprisonment. It was not exile. It was execution, carried out with the elaborate creativity that ancient civilizations reserved for traders and thieves who threatened their most precious resources. Anyone caught would die, and die badly, serving as a warning to others who might contemplate similar crimes. Foreign merchants could buy silk fabric, could marvel at its shimmer and softness, could pay fortunes to transport it westward across mountains and deserts. But they could never purchase the means to produce it themselves. The secret stayed in China, guarded by laws and customs and the simple geographical reality that Chinese officials could inspect any traveler leaving their territory. Emotion value 10/ till now. What made the monks believe they could succeed where countless others must have tried and failed? We cannot know their precise reasoning, but we can imagine the calculation. They possessed cultural access that no Byzantine merchant could match. They knew the language, the customs, the religious practices that would allow them to move through Chinese society without attracting suspicion. They had contacts in Sogdian trading communities who could advise them on the safest routes and the most vulnerable checkpoints. And they had a method that transformed their greatest vulnerability into their greatest advantage. The journey that followed defies easy comprehension even today. 3,500 miles separated China from Constantinople. At the walking pace of medieval travelers, burdened with equipment and the need for secrecy, the journey would require approximately 230 days. That is nearly 2/3 of a year of continuous travel, through terrain that would test the limits of human endurance and resolve. Emotion value 10/how do you even begin to grasp such a journey? Picture leaving your home knowing you will walk until the seasons change completely, then change again, before you see any familiar face. Picture traversing mountains where winter storms could kill in hours, where the path narrowed to ledges above 1,000-foot drops, where a single misstep meant death by falling or death by freezing. Picture descending into deserts where water was measured in drops and carefully hoarded, where the sun-bleached bones of previous travelers served as mile markers along the route, where bandits waited in rocky defiles for exhausted merchants carrying valuable cargo. Now picture doing all of this while concealing living creatures that required specific conditions to survive. Emotion value tense. Think about what that journey demanded in biological terms alone. The monks had to keep silkworm eggs viable across climate zones ranging from Chinese humidity to Central Asian desert. Silkworm eggs are not indestructible packages that can be stuffed in a pocket and forgotten. They are sensitive to temperature extremes, to moisture levels, to the simple passage of time. Eggs kept too warm might hatch prematurely, producing larvae that would starve without mulberry leaves to eat. Eggs kept too cold might die, becoming useless specks that represented months of risk for nothing. The monks had to prevent the larvae from hatching prematurely, which would doom the entire operation since silkworms without mulberry leaves die within days. A single premature hatching meant watching precious creatures wriggle helplessly, unable to find the food their bodies demanded, slowly weakening until death ended their suffering. And there would be no second chances, no returning to China to try again, no explanation that could satisfy imperial disappointment. Emotion value tense. They had to carry young mulberry plants or seeds, either previously smuggled or acquired during the expedition, to ensure future food supplies for their precious cargo once they reached Constantinople. Mulberry cultivation was itself a guarded secret, the foundation upon which the entire silk industry rested. Without mulberry leaves, silkworms could not spin their cocoons, could not produce the precious threads that made the whole enterprise worthwhile. The monks needed not just the insects but their entire ecosystem, transported across half the world. And they had to do all of this while appearing to be exactly what they claimed: humble religious travelers making a pilgrimage, not industrial spies carrying biological contraband worth more than gold. Every interaction with officials, every conversation with fellow travelers, every moment of inspection at checkpoints had to be managed with perfect composure. A single nervous gesture, a single inconsistent answer, a single curious official deciding to examine their belongings too carefully. Any of these could mean discovery and death. The bamboo cane hiding method was elegant in its simplicity. Bamboo walking staves were standard equipment for travelers on the Silk Road, unremarkable objects that attracted no special attention. Every pilgrim carried one. Every merchant leaned on one during long desert crossings. Every traveler used them to test uncertain footing on mountain paths. Guards at checkpoints had seen thousands of bamboo canes and paid them no more attention than they would to a traveler's sandals or water flask. Hollow bamboo sections could contain small quantities of eggs or dormant larvae, protected from temperature extremes by the natural insulating properties of the bamboo itself. The plant material created a microenvironment that buffered against the wild swings between scorching days and freezing nights that characterized travel along the Silk Road. The monks could carry multiple canes, creating redundancy in case some cargo failed during the journey. If eggs in one cane died, perhaps eggs in another would survive. If larvae in one section hatched prematurely and perished, perhaps their siblings in another section would remain dormant until reaching Constantinople. But here is what the historical sources do not tell us, and what makes the achievement even more remarkable when you think carefully about the challenges involved. Silkworm cultivation is extraordinarily demanding even under controlled conditions. Modern sericulture operations maintain carefully monitored environments with precise temperature and humidity controls. With scientific understanding of silkworm biology that would have seemed like magic to 6th century travelers. These monks managed equivalent results using medieval technology during a journey across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. How did they do it? The honest answer is that we do not know the details, only the outcome. Perhaps they had learned from Chinese silk farmers' techniques for keeping eggs dormant during transport. Perhaps they discovered through trial and error which conditions preserved viability and which destroyed it. Perhaps they simply got lucky, blessed by circumstances they could not have planned or predicted. What matters is that the outcome was success. When the monks finally reached Constantinople in 563, they carried viable silkworm eggs and the knowledge to cultivate them. 230 days of continuous risk had paid off. Every checkpoint passed. Every inspection survived. Every night camped in dangerous territory. Every mile walked across hostile terrain had led to this moment. The journey had transformed them. They had left as monks with a mission. They returned as men who had changed history. Now Justinian held in his hand something more valuable than any military conquest. The means to produce silk within his own borders. No more Persian middlemen. No more humiliating dependence on rivals. No more vulnerability that enemies could exploit whenever it suited them. The biological secret that China had guarded for 1,000 years now belonged to Byzantium. The transformation that followed reshaped Byzantine economic power for 600 years. Justinian moved quickly, understanding that speed and secrecy remained essential even after the successful delivery. Imperial silk workshops were established within the Great Palace itself, placing the new industry under direct imperial control from its inception. No provincial nobleman, no ambitious merchant, no potential rival would be permitted to develop independent silk production capabilities. The silkworm secret, having been stolen from China, would now be guarded by Byzantium with equal ferocity. Why such paranoid control? Because Justinian understood exactly what he possessed and exactly what would happen if that possession became common knowledge. If Byzantine nobles could produce their own silk, imperial gifts would lose their special significance. If rival empires learned the secret from Byzantine defectors, the entire strategic advantage would evaporate. The silk monopoly was valuable precisely because it was a monopoly, and monopolies required constant vigilance to maintain. The results exceeded anything the emperor could have anticipated. Within decades, silk production expanded from Constantinople to factories in Beirut, Antioch, Tyre, and Thebes. Each location was carefully selected for climate, for security, for access to transportation networks that could move finished products to markets while keeping production techniques hidden from curious foreigners. The Morea district in southern Greece's Peloponnesus became the empire's mulberry cultivation heartland, where groves of the trees stretched across sun-drenched hillsides, their leaves feeding millions of hungry silkworms in a climate perfectly suited to their needs. You might wonder why Justinian insisted on such strict state control rather than allowing private enterprise to develop the industry more rapidly. After all, private merchants often proved more efficient than government bureaucracies, more innovative, more responsive to market opportunities. Would Byzantine silk production have expanded faster under private ownership? The answer reveals the strategic thinking behind the entire operation. Silk was never merely fabric. It was a weapon. Before Byzantine silk production, only members of the imperial family were allowed to import or wear silk, with only mercantile relatives allowed to export unused portions. This exclusivity made silk the ultimate symbol of imperial authority, a visible marker separating the emperor and his chosen circle from everyone else in the known world. When foreign ambassadors visited Constantinople, they saw silk everywhere in the imperial court. Silk that their own rulers could not match no matter how much gold they possessed. The message was unmistakable. Byzantine power rested on resources that others simply could not obtain. When Justinian obtained independent production capability, he did not democratize access. Instead, he created an even more elaborate system of control that would persist for centuries, ensuring that silk remained a tool of imperial power rather than becoming merely another commodity available to anyone with sufficient wealth. Consider the structure that emerged. 5 separate guilds controlled different stages of silk production. Raw material merchants who handled the cocoons, weavers who transformed threads into fabric, dyers who applied the precious colors, including the legendary purple reserved for imperial use, and retailers who sold finished products to approved customers. Each guild operated under strict imperial supervision, with regulations preventing any single individual or family from controlling the entire production chain. No guild member could compete with others in his own guild, join another guild, or expand operations beyond prescribed limits. This might seem like bureaucratic overreach, like government interference in commerce for its own sake. But the system served a specific purpose. By fragmenting control across multiple guilds, Justinian ensured that no private individual could ever accumulate enough knowledge and resources to challenge imperial dominance of the silk trade. Only the emperor controlled the complete picture. Only the emperor could coordinate all stages of production. Only the emperor could decide who received Byzantine silk and on what terms. Courtwomen in Constantinople could only purchase silk through the House of Lamps, a specialized crown sales facility within the Great Palace. Imagine the scene. Noble ladies arriving at the palace gates, ushered through echoing corridors to a chamber where imperial silk was displayed like treasures in a museum. Prices were set by imperial decree. Quantities were limited by imperial decision. Even the act of buying silk became an interaction with imperial power, a reminder of who controlled access to the empire's most prestigious luxury. All imperial Byzantine silk required marking with the emperor's name or monogram in the selvage, the finished edge of the fabric that proved authenticity. This was not merely branding but proof of origin, a guarantee that the silk was genuine Byzantine production rather than an inferior imitation. Foreign rulers who received Byzantine silk as diplomatic gifts knew they possessed something authenticated by the emperor himself. A motion value 10/Zand, none could be exported without imperial authorization. Even sales conducted in private homes required reporting to the eparch, the father of the city who served as Constantinople's chief economic official. The eparch maintained surveillance networks so comprehensive that foreign ambassadors who attempted to smuggle prohibited goods discovered that customs officials already knew exactly what they had purchased days earlier. The Byzantine silk monopoly was not just an industry. It was a system of state control so comprehensive that modern observers struggle to find adequate comparisons. Imagine if a single government controlled not just the production of smartphones, but every component, every software application, every retail outlet, and every resale transaction. That level of centralized authority is what Byzantium achieved with silk. Why did this matter strategically? Because silk became diplomatic currency, and diplomatic currency translated directly into political power. When Byzantine emperors needed to purchase alliances, they sent silk. A bolt of Byzantine silk could secure loyalty that gold could not buy, because gold was available from multiple sources while Byzantine silk came from only one. When they wanted to intimidate foreign rulers, they displayed silk wealth that rivals could not match. surrounding visiting dignitaries with evidence of resources that no military conquest could obtain. When they sought to corrupt enemy officials, silk bribes proved more effective than gold because accepting Byzantine silk meant accepting Byzantine influence, becoming part of a network of obligations centered on Constantinople. The calculations were precise. A bolt of Byzantine silk was sometimes valued even more highly than its weight in gold. In a world where luxury goods signified divine favor and political legitimacy, controlling the supply of the ultimate luxury good meant controlling the symbols through which power was communicated across civilizations. The monks who walked out of China with bamboo canes had not merely stolen silkworms. They had transferred the means of production for medieval geopolitical authority. What parallels can we draw to our own world? The Byzantine silkworm heist mirrors industrial espionage cases that shape modern technology competition. When Soviet agents stole atomic bomb secrets from the Manhattan Project, they compressed years of research into months of implementation. The espionage was illegal, dangerous, and morally controversial. But it transformed the global balance of power just as surely as the silkworm theft transformed medieval economics. When developing nations reverse engineer pharmaceutical patents, they follow Justinian's logic. Why remain dependent on foreign suppliers when you can produce essential goods yourself? The legal frameworks differ. The moral debates continue. But the underlying strategic calculation is identical to what motivated a 6th century emperor to commission monks for an impossible mission. Emotion value tense/Thath pattern repeats with remarkable consistency across centuries. China's current efforts to acquire Western semiconductor technology, the recruitment of scientists from rival nations through generous salaries and research funding, the theft of trade secrets through cyber espionage and corporate infiltration, all follow the template that two Nestorian monks established in the 6th century. Technology transfer through espionage has shaped civilizations more profoundly than many military conquests. But the Byzantine silk story also contains a warning that modern technology leaders would do well to heed. Monopolies create wealth, but monopolies also create rigidity. The same state control mechanisms that preserved Byzantine silk dominance for 600 years prevented the adaptation necessary when circumstances changed. Guild restrictions prohibited individual craftsmen from competing with each other or joining multiple guilds. Innovation meant deviation from approved methods, and deviation meant punishment. Master craftsmen could employ only 2 assistants, preventing the economies of scale that might have increased production. Apprentices worked under 2-year contracts with fines for early departure, limiting labor mobility. Quality was maintained through regulation, but innovation was stifled by the same forces. When Italian merchants began arriving in Constantinople in large numbers during the 11th century, they encountered a Byzantine commercial system that seemed designed to prevent competition. By that point, 60,000 foreign merchants resided in the capital, and many of them came from maritime republics like Venice and Genoa, where entrepreneurial flexibility was celebrated rather than suppressed. These Italian traders looked at Byzantine guild regulations and saw opportunity in the rigidity. Where Byzantine guildsmen saw security, Italians saw inefficiency. Where Byzantine regulations saw protection, Italian merchants saw competitive advantage waiting to be exploited. The contrast proved fatal over the long term. Italian merchants could form partnerships, pool capital, adapt to market conditions, and expand operations without guild approval. They could respond to opportunities within days, while Byzantine guildsmen navigated bureaucratic requirements that took months. They could innovate freely while Byzantine craftsmen followed prescribed methods under penalty of law. Byzantine guildsmen were legally prohibited from using the same methods. The regulations that had protected Byzantine commerce for centuries instead strangled it when facing opponents who operated under different rules. The system that had seemed like brilliant strategic design became a prison that prevented escape. Here is the painful irony. The same monks who stole China's silk secret could not prevent others from eventually learning Byzantine techniques. Knowledge flows like water, finding cracks in any barrier given enough time. By the 13th century, silk production had spread to Italy and other Western regions, carried by merchants who had spent decades observing Byzantine methods, by craftsmen who defected for better opportunities, by spies who followed the same playbook that Justinian had used against China. The 600-year monopoly was ending, and with it the special strategic advantage that had justified such intensive state control. Byzantine silk became merely one source among several, still valuable but no longer unique, no longer capable of purchasing alliances that gold could not buy. The final blow came not from industrial espionage, but from military catastrophe. In 1204, the Fourth Crusade turned against Constantinople itself. Crusaders who had set out to fight Muslims instead sacked the greatest Christian city on earth, looting approximately 3,600,000 hyperpyra in treasure and destroying economic infrastructure that had taken centuries to build. The silk workshops, the guild systems, the careful regulatory apparatus that had sustained Byzantine commercial dominance, all of this was gutted in a week of pillage. Men who had sworn to fight for Christ destroyed libraries, burned archives, melted down gold religious artifacts for easier transport, and scattered silk workers to the winds. The empire fragmented into 3 successor states, none of which possessed the administrative capability to maintain centralized economic control. The eparch's authority, which had once extended to every transaction in the capital, became a ceremonial title rather than an active administrative role. The surveillance networks dissolved. The guild regulations became unenforceable. The monopoly that had lasted 600 years ended in 7 days of violence. What lessons does this history offer for understanding technology, power, and the nature of strategic competition? First, that seemingly impossible security can be breached by determined individuals with local knowledge. China's 1,000-year silk monopoly seemed unbreakable until 2 monks proved otherwise. Modern organizations that believe their secrets are perfectly protected might consider how comprehensively the Chinese had implemented their security measures, and how completely those measures failed against patient, motivated infiltrators with cultural access. Second, that successful technology transfer requires not just the technology itself, but the institutional structures to exploit it. Justinian did not merely obtain silkworms. He created an entire system of workshops, guilds, regulations, and enforcement mechanisms that transformed biological capability into sustained economic advantage. Modern cases of technology theft often fail not because the technology itself proves flawed, but because the receiving organization lacks the complementary capabilities to implement it effectively. Third, that monopolies inevitably end. The question is not whether competitors will eventually obtain your secrets, but how long you can maintain advantage and what you do with that advantage while you possess it. Byzantium held silk dominance for 600 years. An extraordinary duration that financed armies, purchased alliances, and projected imperial authority across 3 continents. When the monopoly finally ended, the empire had already extracted centuries of strategic benefit. Fourth, that the mechanisms of control can become mechanisms of vulnerability. Byzantine guild regulations prevented internal competition and maintained quality, but they also prevented the flexibility necessary to adapt when external conditions changed. The Italian merchants who eventually dominated Byzantine trade routes succeeded not because they produced better silk, but because their organizational structures allowed faster adaptation to opportunities. And fifth, that technology shapes history in ways that contemporaries rarely anticipate. The monks who smuggled silkworms to Constantinople could not have imagined that their action would sustain Byzantine economic power until the 13th century. They were solving an immediate problem for an immediate emperor. The long-term consequences emerged from the interaction of their technical achievement with Byzantine institutional capabilities and broader historical forces. Today we speak of disruptive technologies as if the concept were modern. But the Byzantine silkworm heist disrupted economic relationships across the entire medieval world. A single successful act of industrial espionage transformed trade routes, shifted diplomatic leverage, and altered the balance of civilizations. Two nameless monks carrying bamboo canes changed more history than most generals who commanded armies of thousands. Emotion value 10/think about what technologies today might be subject to similar transfers, with similar consequences extending across centuries. Semiconductor manufacturing techniques that give certain nations advantages in computing power. Artificial intelligence research that could determine military and economic dominance. Genetic engineering techniques that might reshape agriculture and medicine. Quantum computing breakthroughs that could break encryption securing global communications. Each of these represents knowledge that nations guard jealously and rivals seek desperately. The monks have modern successors. They carry laptops rather than bamboo canes, and their journeys traverse fiber optic cables rather than mountain passes. But they pursue the same objective: transferring the means of production for strategic power from those who possess it to those who seek it. The silkworm heist reminds us that history pivots on individual actions as much as structural forces. Two nameless monks, willing to risk their lives for an emperor's commission, changed the economic trajectory of an empire that would endure for another 900 years. Their bamboo canes contain not just insects, but the seeds of transformation that would reshape the medieval world. When Justinian received news that the monks had succeeded, he must have understood that he had achieved something no army could accomplish. Military conquest required constant expenditure to maintain. Conquered territories rebelled. Defeated enemies rebuilt their strength. But silk production, once established, generated revenue that could finance all other imperial ambitions indefinitely. The emperor had stolen not just silkworms, but the future. That future proved both glorious and tragic. 6 centuries of silk monopoly generated incalculable wealth. But the same centralized control that preserved the monopoly prevented adaptation when monopoly conditions ended. The Byzantine Empire that fell in 1453 was a shadow of the economic superpower Justinian had created. Its silk workshops destroyed. Its guilds dissolved. Its commercial dominance transferred to Italian maritime republics that had learned to exploit Byzantine rigidity. The silkworms, however, survived. They still spin their precious threads today. The descendants of the insects two monks smuggled across 3,500 miles in hollow bamboo canes. The technology transfer succeeded beyond anything Justinian could have imagined, spreading silk production around the world until the fabric that once signified imperial authority became accessible to ordinary consumers in shopping malls and online marketplaces. Perhaps that is the final lesson of the Byzantine silkworm heist. Technologies ultimately escape the control of those who possess them. Monopolies delay but do not prevent diffusion. Secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, eventually become common knowledge. The question for any civilization holding strategic technological advantage is not whether that advantage will be lost, but how to maximize its value while it lasts. Justinian maximized his advantage for 600 years. Few modern leaders could claim similar success. The monks who walked out of China remain anonymous. Byzantine historians recorded the heist but never identified the men who changed world history. We know only that they were Nestorian Christians with connections in Sogdiana. that they traveled approximately 230 days across 3,500 miles, and that they succeeded in transferring biological technology worth more than any treasure. Their bamboo canes are long since rotted. The silkworms they carried have descendants numbering in the billions. And the lesson of their journey echoes across centuries. In the competition between civilizations, technology transfer through espionage has shaped history more profoundly than many of the generals whose names fill our textbooks. The silkworm heist was not just theft. It was transformation. And its echoes resound in every act of industrial espionage, every technology transfer, every attempt to breach the security of strategic knowledge that shapes our world today. 2 monks walked out of China carrying the secret that would transform an empire. 15 centuries later, their successors are still walking, still carrying secrets, still transforming the world.